They told you slavery was about cotton, about tobacco, about endless fields of labor under a burning southern sun. That's the version of history they wanted you to memorize in classrooms, a story sanitized enough to pass as truth. But there is another record, buried in sealed ledgers, whispered in private archives, kept away from the public eye for over a century. A record that does not describe plantations as fields of work, but as laboratories, breeding grounds, places where human beings were reduced to the cold arithmetic of bloodlines, measurements, and profit margins. Imagine this. A leather-bound ledger discovered in 1987 inside the South Carolina Historical Society. Its pages, untouched for generations, carried the handwriting of men who thought themselves farmers but were in truth engineers of flesh. They recorded births the way one might track livestock, noting height, muscle capacity, and resistance to disease. They wrote of improvements, of optimized pairings, of productive outcomes. The words sound clinical, detached, but each entry represented a life, a woman forced, a child catalogued like an experiment, a family dismantled before it even had a chance to exist. This was no isolated cruelty. What the ledger revealed was a network, a conspiracy of plantation elites stretching across South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, and beyond. They called it agricultural innovation. But behind those euphemisms lay a system designed not to harvest crops, but to breed human beings into products. Children separated from mothers at birth, men chosen for their physical strength and sent like stallions to impregnate women they would never know. Entire generations raised not as families, but as commodities to be distributed, traded, and sold. You are about to step inside a world most historians barely whisper about. A truth so disturbing that even abolitionists of the time struggled to believe it when fragments leaked into the light. A world where science was twisted into chains, where human lives became experiments in selective breeding, where Southern aristocrats wrote letters to one another, celebrating the increased yield of their human stock, claiming profits 3 times higher than cotton itself. This isn't just history. It is evidence of how far human beings will go when power, greed, and control eclipse morality. Tonight, I will open the doors they tried to keep locked, step inside America's slave breeding farms, the horrors they tried to hide. Charleston, South Carolina, the 1840s. A city that glittered with wealth and refinement, its elite families parading their sophistication in grand halls and manicured gardens, but beneath the polished veneer of their social rituals, something darker pulsed, a system of control so organized, so deliberate, that it operated with the efficiency of a modern corporation. These men were not just planters, they were strategists, scientists of cruelty, and merchants of human flesh. In their society gatherings, they spoke with pride about agricultural yields, soil management, and the breeding of horses. But behind closed doors, their conversations slipped into other forms of optimization, bloodlines, pairings, measurements. They spoke of enslaved men and women the same way they spoke of livestock, calculating traits to pass on, flaws to eliminate, generations to sculpt. One name echoes through the records: Dr. Edmund Ravenel, a respected physician celebrated in Charleston society, but in his private writings, he was no healer. He was an architect of selective breeding. He kept meticulous reports, tracking the outcomes of forced pairings and comparing them like experiments in a laboratory. He wrote of docility, strength, resistance, and obedience as traits to cultivate. He calculated the value of human lives the way others calculated cotton yields, and he was not alone. Colonel James Rutledge, Colonel Drayton, the Pinckneys, these families weren't simply rich from rice and cotton. They were investors in a hidden enterprise, the systematic breeding of enslaved people for profit. They shared records across plantations, distributing reports, comparing methods, expanding operations. What emerged was no accident, no isolated cruelty. It was a coordinated network, an industry of human reproduction masked as agriculture. The horror was not only in the act itself, but in its precision. The breeding farms were designed for efficiency. Young women kept in dormitories, fed and treated not out of compassion, but because healthier mothers produced more profitable children. Men rotated between plantations, their bodies reduced to genetic stock, forced into unions orchestrated for maximum economic return. Children evaluated at birth, sorted, divided, some raised for premium labor, others discarded into harsher fields where survival was unlikely. This was not chaos. It was order, not brutality for its own sake, but brutality harnessed, measured, refined. And it thrived because secrecy was its greatest weapon. The same Charleston families that hosted elegant parties and funded churches were building a system so cruel, so calculated, that it blurred the line between plantation and laboratory. What you've been told about slavery barely scratches the surface. The truth is far more systematic, far more disturbing, and it was hidden in plain sight. Picture the Ravenel Mansion, East Bay Street, Charleston. A December evening in 1843. The halls glow with lamplight, music drifts through the parlor, and the city's most powerful families gather with wine and cigars, their daughters paraded in silk gowns. To the outside eye, it was refinement at its height, the Southern aristocracy displaying its wealth and poise. But in the shadows of these rooms, behind the polished wood and chandeliers, men spoke in tones they believed the world would never hear. Thomas Whitfield, a young planter recently returned from Harvard, had grown uneasy with Charleston's social circles. His education exposed him to abolitionist thought, ideas that made him restless beneath the false smiles of his peers. That December, he lingered outside Colonel Drayton's study, notebook in hand, the frost of the night stinging his face as he pressed himself against the brick to catch their words. Inside, Dr. Ravenel read from a report. His voice was calm, clinical. Our initiative has exceeded all projections. Millfield Plantation has produced 17 births from selected pairings, average height increased by 2 inches over the prior generation, stronger constitutions, higher endurance. He might have been reading crop yields, but the ledger was about people, children born into bondage, stripped of identity, reduced to measurements. Then Colonel Rutledge added his own findings. The Pinckney estate, he said, had focused on breeding for docility. The results? Less resistance, more compliance, while maintaining physical strength. And then Drayton spoke words that froze Thomas where he stood. Gentlemen, what we have accomplished here extends far beyond individual success. Our network now spans Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia. We are tracking bloodlines across state boundaries, ensuring optimal combinations impossible in isolation. A network, not random. Cruelty, not the whim of a few powerful men, but a system. Records coordinated, bloodlines monitored, children distributed like commodities. They were building something unprecedented. An industry of human breeding, designed with the precision of science and the ambition of empire. Thomas's hand shook as he scribbled notes in the dark, realizing what he had stumbled into. This was not just slavery as the world already condemned it. This was slavery refined, industrialized, made into a machine of calculated reproduction. And the men speaking so casually in that candle-lit study, the same men who bowed their heads in church pews on Sunday, were the engineers of a hidden horror that would haunt history. They didn't call it a marketplace, they wrapped it in softer words: family growth, natural increase, domestic supply. But every man, woman and child on those farms knew the truth. Their very bodies were currency. Breeding farms existed not to raise crops, but to raise human beings as stock, sold like livestock across a nation that called itself free. On these hidden plantations, the logic of profit dictated the most intimate aspects of human life. Slaveholders forced men and women into unions, sometimes against their will, with a single objective: produce children. Those children would not be born into families. They would be born into ledgers, listed as assets, valued in dollars before they ever took their first breath. A child was not celebrated as a new life, but as a future price at auction. The cruelty ran deeper than chains or whips. It was psychological, generational, designed to hollow out the very meaning of kinship. Husbands were separated from wives, mothers were stripped from their infants, young girls were pushed into forced pairings long before they were old enough to even understand what was happening to them. The body was not seen as sacred, it was seen as a machine for profit. In Virginia and Maryland, entire estates were dedicated to this practice. Unlike the cotton fields of the Deep South, these farms had one main product: human lives. And from these centers, countless men, women, and children were shipped downriver, filling the insatiable demand of the Cotton Kingdom. Every sale lined the pockets of men who justified their cruelty with scripture, law, and greed. But within the shadows of this system, whispers spread among the enslaved. They shared stories, passed warnings, held fast to songs that carried coded messages. Even in the heart of this calculated nightmare, they resisted, sometimes in quiet defiance, sometimes in acts so bold that I shocked the slaveholders into rage. This was not simply history. It was an engineered economy of flesh hidden in plain sight, where the word breeding replaced humanity itself, and America for decades let it happen. They were not myths, they were not whispers of rumor. These farms had names, locations, and overseers who recorded their deeds in ledgers still rotting in archives. In Virginia, men spoke of the Jesse Torrey accounts, records describing young women forced to bear child after child. In Maryland, the Butler Plantation became notorious for sending stock downriver, children stripped from their mothers before they could walk. And in Richmond, dealers like Robert Lumpkin turned human breeding into calculated commerce, managing slave jails where forced pairings were ordered as casually as one might breed horses. The language used was chillingly precise. Women of prime age were listed like broodmares. Men described as bucks were priced not only for their strength, but for how many children they might sire. Plantation owners debated strategies. Should they favor quantity, many births at once, or quality, pairing men and women who might produce stronger offspring for the labor camps of Mississippi and Louisiana? Every decision was transactional. Every life was weighed against profit. But the true horror was how normal it became to those who ran it. They ate their suppers, drank their whiskey, prayed in their churches, and by morning returned to their ledgers, plotting the next cycle of forced reproduction. Their wealth multiplied while generations of enslaved families dissolved, broken before they could ever begin. Still, the enslaved resisted. Some women found ways to sabotage the system, using herbs to end pregnancies forced upon them. Others refused to submit, choosing punishment over compliance. Men risked torture or death to defend their partners, and in rare fleeting moments, love triumphed even under chains. Families carved out bonds in the margins of brutality, bonds that no auction block could fully erase. These farms were not accidents of history. They were deliberate, structured and sustained by a nation that demanded cotton, sugar and tobacco at any cost. And when the Civil War finally came, many of these places tried to vanish from memory, records burned, owners denied, descendants silenced. But memory is not so easily buried. The ghosts of those farms still walk among us, etched into bloodlines, whispered in families who wonder why their past begins with silence. The breeding farms of Virginia and Maryland did not exist in isolation. They were engines, supplying the South's greatest hunger, labor for cotton. After the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed in 1808, plantation owners in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas faced a crisis. They could no longer import men and women from Africa, but their empire, the sprawling cotton fields that drove America's wealth, was expanding faster than ever. They needed bodies, they needed children, and the slave breeding farms of the Upper South answered that call. Every child born into bondage in Maryland or Virginia was worth a fortune farther south. Dealers marched chained coffles of men, women, and children hundreds of miles, or loaded them onto ships bound for New Orleans. There, the markets overflowed with what they chillingly called Virginia Negroes, the human supply line that made the Deep South possible. The demand was monstrous. Cotton was not just an agricultural product, it was America's gold. By the 1850s, it made up more than half of all U.S. exports. European mills devoured it, feeding the Industrial Revolution, and behind every bale stood the bodies of enslaved people, ripped from families, torn from the only lands they had ever known. The breeders of the Upper South grew rich, while the cotton barons of the Lower South built empires that rivaled kings. The system was perfectly interlocked. The North financed it with banks and insurance. The South expanded it with land and lashes. And the breeding farms kept the machine alive with a steady stream of new lives, lives that were never seen as lives at all, only as investments, numbers in a ledger, hands for a field, wombs for the next generation of profit. But in the whispers of those who survived, the truth spread. Mothers told their children the names of fathers sold away. Elders carried songs that reminded them of home, long before the chain gangs. These memories, fragile and secret, became acts of defiance in a world that sought to strip away every trace of humanity. The Cotton Empire appeared unshakable, yet its foundation was built on stolen wombs and broken families, and deep down, even its masters knew that something this unnatural, this brutal, could not last forever. The cruelest wound of the breeding farms was not just the chains, not even the forced unions. It was the systematic destruction of family itself. In this twisted economy, a mother's love, a father's protection, a child's innocence, none of it was sacred. It was all negotiable. It was all for sale. A child could be torn from his mother's arms before he could speak, marched south in a trader's coffle. A husband could be forced to sire children with women he did not choose, while his own wife was sold away to another plantation. A young girl, barely in her teens, might be targeted by overseers who saw her body as nothing more than a future investment. Every bond that should have been unbreakable was weaponized against them. Plantation records show it with chilling clarity. Children listed as increase. Mothers valued only for the number of births they survived. Men reduced to studs, pushed to impregnate as many women as possible. The language of family was erased, replaced with the cold arithmetic of profit. And yet the enslaved fought to hold on to what little they could. Families stitched themselves together in fragments. A child raised by an aunt when his parents were sold away. A woman protecting the memory of her firstborn, even as her womb was forced to bear another. Songs carried names and stories like smuggled treasures, preserving them against the silence that slaveholders tried to impose. For the enslaved, love itself became resistance. To care for one another in a world built to erase them was an act of defiance. To whisper prayers over a newborn, knowing that child might one day be ripped away, was a declaration that they were more than property, more than flesh to be bought and sold. Slaveholders claimed they had destroyed the black family. They boasted of it in ledgers, in speeches, in laws that denied kinship. But the truth is more powerful. Families bent, broke, and reformed. But they endured. In secret, in fragments, through whispered names and stolen embraces, they carried on. The breeding farms turned families into currency, but they could not kill the idea of family itself. That idea survived, and it would one day fuel the fire that consumed the very system built to erase it. The breeding farms were not sustained by chains alone. Chains could bind bodies, but to control generations, the enslavers needed something stronger: fear. Fear became the invisible lash, the tool that reached deeper than iron shackles ever could. Overseers used it with precision. A pregnant woman who resisted could be whipped until her screams silenced others from daring to fight. A man who tried to protect his partner might be dragged before the others, tortured as an example. Children were forced to watch, the terror etched into their minds before they even understood why. Fear was not an accident of cruelty. It was policy, engineered to break wills and pass trauma from parent to child. Religion was twisted into the system. Enslavers quoted scripture to claim obedience was divine will, that resistance was rebellion not just against masters but against God himself. Sunday sermons became another shackle, turning faith into a weapon to keep the enslaved submissive. Yet in hidden corners beneath the night sky, the enslaved whispered their own prayers, prayers not of submission, but of survival and freedom. Surveillance was constant. On these farms, privacy did not exist. Overseers watched when couples were forced together. They recorded births. They counted cycles. The body itself was monitored as though it were a machine, its productivity measured, its rebellion punished. This constant scrutiny drove many to silence, teaching them to bury emotions so deep that even tears felt dangerous. But fear has limits. The more brutally it was applied, the more resistance smoldered beneath the surface. Some fled into the forests and swamps, risking dogs, patrols, and death rather than surrender to breeding. Others poisoned food, broke tools, or feigned illness, small rebellions that slowed the machine. And in rare, defiant moments, revolts erupted, shaking the very foundations of the system. The enslavers believed fear was their ultimate weapon, but in trying to rule by terror, they revealed their greatest weakness. They knew that without control, the system would collapse. They feared freedom as much as the enslaved feared the lash. On the breeding farms, every scream, every silence, every prayer became part of a hidden war, a war not fought on battlefields, but in the shadows of barns, cabins, and fields where life itself was twisted into profit. The breeding farms were not just about filling cotton fields, they were pipelines of wealth, rivers of profit that flowed straight into the veins of America's power. Every child born on those farms, every body sold downriver, translated into political influence, bank fortunes, and institutions that still stand today. Slaveholders in Virginia and Maryland grew rich not from crops but from flesh. They sold men, women, and children southward by the tens of thousands, and the money bought more land, finer homes, and seats of influence. Some of the nation's most respectable families built their legacies on the bloodline trade. The wealth trickled upward, funding banks in the north, insurance firms in New York, and merchants in Boston who never saw a plantation but profited from every sale. In Washington, the system had defenders at the highest level. Politicians protected the domestic slave trade with laws that masked brutality under the language of property rights. Newspapers printed advertisements for breeding women as casually as they did notices for horses. Courts upheld the practice, shielding slaveholders from accountability. In the halls of Congress, representatives from slaveholding states grew bolder, their numbers swelled by the very system that treated human reproduction as commerce. The infamous Three-Fifths Compromise gave slave states disproportionate power, counting the enslaved as numbers for representation while denying them humanity. The more children the breeding farms produced, the more seats the South claimed in government. Every forced birth was not only profit, but political capital, tightening slavery's grip on the Union. Even institutions draped in respectability were complicit. Churches split over the question of slavery, but many Southern congregations defended the breeders, blessing their actions as God's order. Universities received endowments funded by slave profits. Roads, railroads, and canals were built with money wrung from the suffering of enslaved mothers and children. The breeding farms were never just hidden corners of cruelty. They were the backbone of an economy and the foundation of a political order. They ensured that slavery was not just tolerated, it was protected, expanded, and enshrined at the core of the American system. This is why the horror endured so long. It was not only enforced by whips and chains, but by laws, ledgers, pulpits, and ballots. The very people who claimed to stand for liberty stood silent, or worse, they profited from the silence. For years, the breeding farms thrived in the shadows, their cruelty cloaked by silence. Planters spoke in euphemisms, ledgers hid behind locked doors, and the public pretended not to know. But whispers have a way of traveling, and slowly the truth leaked northward, carried by runaways, by letters, by rare souls willing to bear witness. Abolitionists seized on these accounts. They spoke not just of slavery in the fields, but of slavery in the bedroom, the nursery, the womb. Pamphlets began to circulate describing women forced to bear children like cattle, of families ripped apart for profit, of children branded as stock before they could even walk. To the northern conscience, already strained by the brutality of the lash, this revelation struck deeper. Slavery was not only labor, it was breeding. It reached into the most sacred bonds of human life. Figures like Frederick Douglass, himself born in Maryland, hinted at the ugly reality. He described the way masters used their power over enslaved women, fathering children who were then sold for gain. Others, like Jesse Torrey and Theodore Weld, published testimonies from survivors who spoke in hushed tones of being forced into unions, their children priced before they were born. These accounts spread through abolitionist newspapers, igniting outrage in audiences who had never seen a plantation but could imagine the violation of family. The South, of course, denied it. Planters called the stories exaggerations, Northern propaganda designed to slander their way of life. They insisted that enslaved families were treated with care, that childbirth was natural, that sales were simply part of business. But their denials rang hollow against the mounting testimonies of those who had lived it. And in the hidden rooms of abolitionist meetings, the strategy shifted. It was no longer enough to argue that slavery was cruel in Lee. It had to be exposed as a system of sexual exploitation, of forced breeding, of calculated destruction of families. By tearing away the mask of respectability, abolitionists struck at the moral core of the system. The whispers became words, the words became speeches, and soon the speeches became fire. The breeding farms, once America's most guarded secret, were being dragged into the light. As abolitionists began to whisper of breeding farms, Southern leaders did not retreat, they doubled down. Every accusation of cruelty was met with louder denials, every testimony dismissed as abolitionist lies. To admit the truth would be to admit the system was built on rot, and that they could never allow. Politicians from the South sharpened their rhetoric. They claimed slavery was not only lawful, but righteous. They branded it a positive good, declaring that black people were better off enslaved than free. In speeches delivered to packed halls, men of wealth and power insisted that forced reproduction was nothing more than natural increase. They made it sound clinical, inevitable, even benevolent, masking brutality with the language of science and providence. The press joined the chorus. Southern newspapers mocked abolitionists as hysterics, inventing stories to stir up unrest. They printed glossy portraits of plantations as orderly, paternalistic communities where enslaved women supposedly raised children in peace. Behind those staged images, women were being forced into pairings, children were being marched in chains, and men were being broken for refusing to comply. Slaveholders turned to scripture as their shield. Ministers thundered from pulpits, twisting verses to defend the system. They preached that obedience was divine will, that bondage was biblical, that masters stood as fathers to their enslaved. It was a holy mask on an unholy empire, and many swallowed it whole. But the louder the South defended itself, the more obvious its fear became. Why argue so desperately if there was nothing to hide? Why threaten? Why silence? Why censor if the breeding farms were truly fiction? Every denial hinted at the truth they could not erase. The divide deepened. In the North, whispers turned to outrage, fueling abolitionist movements. In the South, the defenses grew harsher, the punishments more severe, the silence more enforced. Breeding farms, once hidden in plain sight, had now become the South's most guarded secret, a secret worth lying for, a secret worth killing for. The system had been exposed, if only in fragments, and as the country edged closer to war, those fragments became daggers aimed at the heart of slavery itself. The South could deny, politicians could lie, newspapers could twist, but the voices of the enslaved themselves, those who escaped, those who risked everything to speak, were harder to silence. Their words, carried across the Mason-Dixon line, struck like lightning against the illusion of Southern honor. Men and women who fled the breeding farms told stories that stripped away every pretense. They spoke of nights where overseers forced couples together like livestock, of children sold before their mother's milk had dried, of women whipped until they miscarried babies they never wanted to conceive. These were not abstract arguments, they were lived nightmares written in scars and silence. Abolitionist presses seized on these testimonies, pamphlets like American Slavery. As it is collected eyewitness accounts that shocked Northern audiences. Frederick Douglass, who had known the lash in Maryland, revealed how masters fathered children with enslaved women, children they then sold for profit. Others, like Harriet Jacobs, laid bare the sexual terror enslaved women endured, telling truths so raw that even sympathetic readers struggled to comprehend them. Each story was a weapon. Each confession tore at the polished defenses of the South. The breeding farms could no longer be hidden behind words like natural increase. They were exposed as what they truly were, engines of forced reproduction, fueled by greed and guarded by terror. The risk for these voices was immense. Runaways who spoke out knew that capture meant torture, mutilation, or death. Even in the North, bounty hunters stalked them, while Southern papers placed rewards on their heads. Yet still they spoke, still they wrote, still they testified before audiences who wept, raged, and began to question how long a nation could tolerate such crimes. The enslaved themselves became historians, witnesses, and prophets. They were not just victims of the breeding farms, they were the ones who shattered the silence around them, and with every word, every story they pulled America closer to a reckoning it could no longer escape. The system that thrived on secrecy now faced its greatest enemy, truth spoken aloud. By the mid-1840s, the North was no longer hearing whispers, they were hearing fire. The testimonies of the enslaved, once dismissed as exaggerations, began to align with evidence smuggled out of the South. Ledgers, bills of sale, personal letters between planters describing improvements in their stock. The breeding farms were no longer rumor, they were fact. Abolitionists seized this momentum. Lecturers toured cities from Boston to Philadelphia, recounting horrors in halls so crowded that men stood shoulder to shoulder just to hear. Newspapers published serialized accounts of enslaved women forced to bear child after child, their suffering transmuted into columns that Northern families read over breakfast. The effect was explosive. What had been a political debate about tariffs and states' rights now became a moral confrontation with human cruelty laid bare. And yet, every voice raised against slavery was met with a Southern counterattack. Wealthy planters defended the breeding system with a perverse pride, claiming it was proof of their agricultural science. They boasted of rising birth rates as evidence that their slaves were well cared for. The hypocrisy was staggering, but the defense revealed something more. They knew they were being watched, and they feared exposure. This fear grew as the Underground Railroad expanded. Every man, woman, and child who escaped from the South carried not just their body, but their story. Some abolitionists urged discretion, but the truth could not be contained. Breeding farms became a rallying cry, a symbol of slavery's absolute inhumanity. For the first time, cracks appeared in the South's iron wall of denial. Northern churches thundered against the sin. Activists demanded the government investigate. Petitions flooded Congress, demanding answers about forced breeding and systematic abuse. In response, Southern representatives grew louder, angrier, and more desperate. They understood what was at stake. If America truly looked into the breeding farms, the entire foundation of slavery would collapse. The fire had been lit. The truth had slipped through the cracks, and once a nation begins to see what it was never meant to see, no amount of denial can return it to blindness. The louder the voices grew, the more vicious the response became. America's ruling families, the very dynasties who profited most from breeding farms, understood that exposure was a death sentence, so they activated the machinery of suppression, a system far older and far colder than any single plantation. Southern newspapers, often funded by planter wealth, published editorials mocking abolitionist claims as Northern hysteria. Editors carefully reframed breeding farms as nothing more than natural increase, insisting that enslaved women bore children out of loyalty and contentment. These lies were repeated so often, so loudly, that they began to sound like truth to those who wanted to believe them. But propaganda was only the first shield. The second was violence. Abolitionist speakers in the South were beaten, tarred, feathered, and driven from towns. Printing presses were destroyed in midnight raids. Black men and women suspected of aiding escapes were tortured for information, their bodies made into warnings. Silence was enforced with blood. Then came the politicians. In Congress, Southern representatives thundered that any mention of slavery's breeding practices was an attack on property rights. They pushed through gag rules to prevent petitions from being read aloud, choking debate before it could begin. Behind closed doors, wealthy planters lobbied presidents, funded campaigns, and ensured that no investigation ever threatened their profits. And finally, there was the church. Ministers in the South twisted scripture into chains, declaring that God himself had sanctioned slavery and that multiplying enslaved populations was a divine blessing. Sermons became weapons, designed not to uplift the soul but to cage it. This was the full spectrum of control: propaganda, violence, politics, religion. Four walls built around the breeding farms, sealing them off for Rome scrutiny. Anyone who dared to peer inside was silenced, discredited, or destroyed. But suppression has its own weakness. The harder you try to bury the truth, the more power it gains when it breaks through. And in America, the truth about the breeding farms was building pressure like water behind a dam. Every testimony, every document, every whispered story carried north. The cracks were widening. The masters believed they could contain it forever, but history was moving against them, and soon their empire of silence would face its greatest test. The profits from slave breeding farms flowed like blood money into every corner of America's expansion. Cotton, tobacco, rice, none of it could flourish without the forced growth of the enslaved population. By the early 1800s, natural reproduction had become more valuable than the transatlantic trade itself. Plantation owners realized they didn't need ships from Africa when they could manufacture new generations of laborers in their own backyards. The children born of this system were not free, not even for a breath. They were catalogued, priced, and sold long before they could walk. The cruelty was systematic. Enslaved women were labeled by fertility: how many children they could bear, how quickly they recovered, how strong their offspring appeared. Men were judged for their size, their endurance, their ability to pass on traits that slaveholders could profit from. In the language of ledgers, they weren't mothers and fathers. They were breeders. In the eyes of slave traders, they were investments, not families. This system of breeding did more than expand the enslaved population. It corrupted the very foundation of kinship. Children were often fathered by white masters but sold as property, forced into the same system their fathers profited from. Lineages were blurred, erased, or denied altogether. The result was a shadow family tree, one where blood ties were severed, silenced, or buried beneath shame. Every sale, every birth, every forced union added bricks to the empire America was building. The wealth of banks, railroads, and shipping companies was tied to these farms. The comfort of households in the North and South alike was stained with their profits. Yet history books rarely whisper about this machinery of human reproduction. The silence is deliberate, because to acknowledge it is to admit that entire generations were manufactured like livestock for the sole purpose of exploitation. Slave breeding farms were not isolated terrors. They were woven into the very geography of America. In Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas, they spread like hidden wounds across the land, quietly fueling the expansion of the South while feeding the slave markets of the Deep South. Their barns, fields, and cramped shacks looked ordinary from the outside, but inside them lay one of the darkest industries in history. Travelers riding past would never guess what horrors took place beyond those fences. That was the point: concealment. The machinery of exploitation operated best in silence. The enslaved were moved like cattle from one farm to another, their futures decided at the auction block or in the notebooks of their masters. Some families lived in terror of being sent south, where the demand for labor was insatiable. Others dreaded being kept behind for breeding, knowing their bodies would never belong to them again. Every option was a cage, and every path led to despair. Enslaved women bore the deepest scars. Their fertility was turned into a weapon against them. Many lived in constant fear of pregnancies forced upon them, of children who would be torn from their arms before they had the chance to raise them. For many, giving birth did not bring joy. It brought grief because the child's future had already been sold. To this day, the ruins of these farms are rare, their traces buried under fields, towns, and plantations that have been repurposed or erased. The silence is not an accident, it is the deliberate burying of evidence. The breeding farms challenge the myth of a gentle South, tearing apart the romantic illusions that still cloud history. They show us the raw truth. America's growth was not just built on slavery, but on the mass production of enslaved lives. The breeding farms reveal a truth many still refuse to confront. Slavery was not only about labor, but about ownership of the human body at its most intimate level. Control extended beyond the whip and the field. It reached into the womb, the bloodline, and the very future of generations. Slaveholders believed they could engineer a population, bending biology to serve profit. In their arrogance, they treated reproduction like a crop to be harvested. Imagine the crushing weight of this reality. An enslaved woman carrying a child knew that her pregnancy was not her own. The child in her womb already had a price, a destination, a fate chosen by men who would never see it as a son or daughter. She carried life, but to her captors it was only capital. For the father, if he was permitted to know the child at all, the bond could be ripped away at any moment. Love itself was criminalized when it interfered with profit. Some of the enslaved resisted quietly, though their acts of defiance rarely appear in records. Women risked punishment by using herbs to end pregnancies, denying their masters the next body for sale. Men fought against forced pairings, refusing to be reduced to breeders, even when it meant brutal punishment. Every act of resistance was an assertion of humanity in a system designed to erase it. Yet the breeding farms endured, shielded by law and protected by silence. Legislators debated tariffs, expansion and trade, but rarely touched the unspoken reality that the natural increase of the enslaved population was becoming the South's most profitable resource. Every birth fueled a system designed to never let them go. The legacy of these farms is not only in the bloodlines fractured by force, but in the silence that followed. Families today trace their ancestry and encounter gaps, blank spaces where names, fathers or mothers should be. Those voids are not accidental. They are the scars left by a nation that tried to erase the crimes that made it powerful. On the breeding farms, nothing was sacred. Marriage among the enslaved held no legal recognition, no protection. A husband and wife could be separated at a master's whim, their vows shattered with a single transaction. Children were stripped from their mothers and sold before they could even speak their first words. Families were dismantled not by accident, but by design, because profit demanded it. The enslaved clung to love in defiance of this cruelty. Secret marriages took place under the cover of night, with whispered vows exchanged in candlelight or beneath trees. Parents carved lullabies into memory, songs meant to be passed down even if the child was taken. These fragile acts of humanity were seeds of resistance, proof that even in chains, the spirit refused to die. But the system was merciless. It fed on these bonds, breaking them apart to remind the enslaved that nothing, no union, no family, no love, was safe from the auction block. The children born of these farms often grew up without knowledge of their true parents. They became commodities, shuffled between plantations, their identities erased before they had a chance to form. For some, the only record of their existence was a line in a ledger, a number in an account book. The erasure was total, meant to strip away heritage and leave behind only property. Yet even in this engineered despair, traces of resistance lived on. Oral histories carried fragments of the truth, stories passed quietly through generations about mothers who fought to keep their children, fathers who risked their lives to see them, families who tried to run together rather than be torn apart. These stories became invisible threads, tying descendants to the pain and strength of their ancestors. The breeding farms were more than places of forced birth. They were machines built to dismantle family, faith and memory. By targeting the very foundation of kinship, they sought to ensure that the enslaved had no future beyond what their oppressors demanded. That is why these farms remain one of the most chilling and least spoken truths in American history. The breeding farms did not exist in a vacuum. They were supported, justified, and protected by law. Legislators, judges, and politicians turned their eyes away, crafting policies that ensured the trade in human life would thrive. The Constitution itself, with its infamous 3/5 compromise, had already reduced enslaved people to fractions of humanity. By the early 1800s, laws across the South solidified the principle that children would inherit the status of their mother. This single legal rule transformed every enslaved woman's womb into an engine of perpetual slavery. Slaveholders knew this law was their greatest weapon. A child born to an enslaved mother was automatically enslaved, regardless of who the father was. This meant that even when white masters fathered children through coercion, assault, or exploitation, those children were still classified as property. The cycle was self-replicating, and no amount of shame or cruelty could disrupt its economic value. Profit was legalized, and morality was erased. Courtrooms became theaters of betrayal. Cases brought by the enslaved fighting for their children or challenging their status were almost always dismissed. The law itself was built to crush them, to deny them personhood, to make resistance seem impossible. Plantations became fortified not only by fences and chains but by statutes and rulings that sanctified oppression under the banner of legality. Northern states, often painted as free and righteous, were not innocent either. Banks in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia funded Southern expansion. Insurance companies underwrote the lives of the enslaved, calculating premiums on men, women, and children as though they were livestock. The breeding farms thrived because the entire nation, North and South, found a way to profit from them. This legal and financial web was perhaps the cruelest part of all. It showed that the horror was not just the work of a few brutal masters, but the machinery of a nation. The breeding farms were not hidden because no one knew. They were hidden because too many knew, and too many benefited. The breeding farms left behind a silence that is louder than words. Walk across the fields today, and you will see nothing but grass, soil, and trees. The barns have collapsed, the fences are gone, and the ledgers lie buried in archives few dare to open. Yet beneath that silence rests a history written in blood and bone. The earth itself remembers. Every child torn from their mother, every body broken for profit, every family shattered. Those memories seeped into the land. This silence was not accidental. After the Civil War, America chose forgetting over reckoning. The breeding farms were scrubbed from textbooks, their stories reduced to whispers in family tales. Plantations were romanticized as sites of charm and tradition, their horrors painted over with images of magnolias and ballrooms. Tour guides spoke of elegance, not the cries of women forced to bear children for sale. The nation wanted the myth, not the truth. But silence cannot erase scars. Generations of descendants still feel the weight of these hidden crimes. Gaps in family trees, surnames that trace back to owners instead of bloodlines, identities that begin and end with records of property, all of it flows from the breeding farms. These scars are not just historical, they are living. To acknowledge this past is not to dwell in shame, but to confront reality. The breeding farms were the blueprint of systemic exploitation, showing how deeply human lives can be reduced when greed replaces morality. Their silence is dangerous because silence allows myths to grow, and myths protect the crimes of the powerful. Breaking that silence is an act of defiance against history's erasure. It is to stand in the fields where barns once stood and say, "This happened." It is to tell the stories that were buried, to remember the faces that were never recorded, and to refuse the lies of a gentle South. The truth of the breeding farms must not remain hidden. For many descendants of the enslaved, the search for truth is like walking through a house of broken mirrors. Family lines vanish into ledgers, names change hands with every sale, and the trail ends not with ancestors but with prices. On breeding farms, children were not given the dignity of lineage. They were given numbers, ages, and monetary value. A son was not a son. A daughter was not a daughter. They were entries in an account book, their identities stripped away before they could form. This erasure still haunts families today. People dig through archives, church records, and census rolls, only to find gaps where kin should be. A mother listed without her children, a father marked as unknown, a child sold before their first birthday, never recorded again. These silences are not accidents, they are the shadows of the breeding farms, designed to erase the humanity of those they exploited. The legacy is more than missing names, it is the weight of not knowing, the ache of disconnection. For descendants, the question of who they are is tied to histories stolen by force. Some carry the trauma in ways they cannot explain, an inherited grief passed down through generations, a sorrow born in fields their families once worked, a silence that has lived too long. Yet within this erasure lies resilience. Oral traditions, whispered stories, and fragments of memory became survival tools. Families clung to scraps of identity, preserving names in songs, or passing down hidden truths about ancestors who resisted, escaped, or endured. These fragments may seem small, but they are acts of rebellion against the system that tried to erase them. The breeding farms tried to destroy the idea of family among the enslaved, but the fact that descendants exist today, still searching, still piecing together the puzzle of their lineage, is proof of something powerful. They failed to erase everything. The bloodlines they tried to turn into property still carry memory, strength, and the hunger for truth. The breeding farms expose the deepest contradiction at the heart of America. The same nation that declared all men are created equal was systematically multiplying human bondage through forced reproduction. While politicians preached liberty, barns and shacks across the South echoed with the cries of women giving birth to children already enslaved. Freedom was a mask worn in daylight, while in the shadows, the machinery of breeding turned lives into property. Slaveholders defended the practice with twisted logic. They claimed it was natural increase, not cruelty. They argued that the enslaved were better off multiplying under their control than left to their own lives. Some even cloaked their greed in religion, twisting scripture to justify turning mothers into breeders and children into stock. The hypocrisy was staggering. Christian prayers whispered in the morning, followed by auctions in the afternoon. The truth was simpler, colder: profit. Every child born meant thousands of dollars in future labor. Every forced pairing was an investment. The masters did not see families, they saw balance sheets. They did not hear cries of pain, they heard the sound of wealth expanding. Morality was irrelevant when greed ruled the land. And yet, despite all this, humanity survived. The enslaved held on to dignity in the smallest ways. Through songs, through secret names for children, through bonds of love that no ledger could record. These acts of resistance may not have toppled the system, but they carried something more enduring than profit, the unbreakable truth that no amount of breeding could erase the soul. This contradiction, the land of liberty built on human bondage, still echoes today. To understand America's story without the breeding farms is to believe in a half-truth, a polished myth. To confront them is to face the reality that the nation's greatest wealth was built not only on stolen labor, but on stolen generations. The breeding farms were more than hidden sites of cruelty. They were the beating heart of an economy disguised in plain sight. By the 1820s and 1830s, the United States had outlawed the international slave trade, but the demand for labor had not slowed. Cotton was expanding westward, tobacco remained profitable, rice and sugar demanded endless hands. Without ships from Africa, the South turned inward, forcing its enslaved population to reproduce at rates that could sustain the hunger of the market. This was not chance, it was design. The breeding farms became the factories of America's future. Every birth was profit. A girl born on one of these farms might be sold before adolescence, carrying a price tag higher than most poor white families would see in a lifetime. A boy born strong and healthy might fetch a small fortune at auction. Slaveholders kept detailed records, measuring the productivity of women not in hours worked, but in the number of children delivered. Fertility was currency, and enslaved mothers were forced to pay with their bodies. The cycle was relentless. The horror of this system went beyond economics. It reached into psychology. Imagine being told your only worth was the children you could produce, children you would almost certainly lose. For the men, imagine being paired with women not of your choosing, forced to father children you could never raise. These were not families. They were calculated pairings arranged by overseers who treated intimacy like livestock breeding. Love was not forbidden, it was irrelevant. What mattered was multiplication. And yet, within this machinery of cruelty, sparks of defiance glowed. Women whispered about herbs that could end pregnancies, taking back control of their bodies even at great risk. Men ran, fought or resisted, refusing to be reduced to stud animals for the profit of their masters. Families fled together, or gambling everything on the hope of freedom rather than surrendering their children to the system. These were desperate, dangerous acts, but they were also proof that humanity refused to be extinguished. Today, the evidence of these farms is faint: ruins in fields, scattered documents, fragments of oral history. But their legacy is everywhere. It lives in the wealth built on their backs, in the broken genealogies of descendants searching for stolen names, and in the silence of history books that rarely speak their truth. To uncover the story of America is to uncover them, because without the breeding farms, the scale of slavery's shadow cannot be understood. The breeding farms did not end with emancipation. Their legacy seeped into the soil of America, shaping generations that followed. When slavery was abolished, the physical chains were broken, but the wounds carved into families remained. Freed men and women walked into a world where their identities had been stolen, their names replaced with those of owners, their kin scattered across states. Reconstruction could not rebuild what breeding farms had destroyed: centuries of fractured lineages and erased ancestry. Families searched for one another, traveling miles with nothing but fragments of memory. Some reunited, most never did. The silence that followed emancipation was filled with unanswered questions. Who was my mother? Where is my child? Did my brother survive? The economic system built on forced reproduction did not vanish either. The wealth it created had already spread into banks, factories, railroads, and estates. Generational fortunes in the United States can still be traced back to this hidden industry. Families who once bred human beings reinvested their profits, passing down riches built on bloodlines they destroyed. Meanwhile, the descendants of those who endured the farms inherited poverty, loss, and silence. That imbalance was not accidental, it was engineered. The psychological toll also lingered. Generations grew up with stories cut short, with identities blurred by the deliberate erasure of records. The enslaved were stripped of surnames, and their children carried the names of their masters instead of their own families. For descendants, tracing ancestry often ends in blank spaces, ledgers that list people as property, not as kin. That loss of history is its own kind of violence, stretching across time. And then there is the silence of America itself. Textbooks sanitized slavery, focusing on plantations and labor while leaving the breeding farms in shadows. The nation preferred to look away, to tell a story of progress while burying the machinery of reproduction that fueled its rise. Plantations were marketed as wedding venues, their brutality washed in nostalgia, their barns remembered for charm instead of chains. This deliberate forgetting was a second injustice, an erasure of truth. To speak of the breeding farms now is not to open old wounds, but to confront the truth of what shaped this country. They were not aberrations. They were central to the American story. And until their reality is faced, the silence will continue to echo louder than the history itself. The story of America's slave breeding farms ends not in the past but in the present. Their barns may have rotted, their fields may have been plowed under, but their shadow is alive in the bones of this country. Every missing surname, every fractured lineage, every unanswered question about ancestry carries the echo of those places. The farms were designed to erase identity, and that erasure still lingers, passed from generation to generation like an invisible inheritance. But silence cannot last forever. Today, researchers, descendants, and truth-seekers are dragging these hidden histories back into the light. Old ledgers once tucked away in dusty archives are being read aloud. Oral histories whispered across generations are being recorded, preserved, and honored. The ghosts of the breeding farms are speaking, and with each uncovered truth, the false myths of a gentle South begin to collapse. These revelations are not just about the past. They are about power, who had it, how it was used, and how its effects still shape the present. The breeding farms remind us that slavery was not simply about labor, but about control of the most sacred human bond: family. They remind us that greed can twist biology into commerce, that even birth itself can be stolen when humanity is stripped away. And they remind us that forgetting is dangerous. Erasure allows injustice to repeat, cloaked in new forms. To name these farms, to tell their stories, is to refuse erasure. It is to say that the lives reduced to property were not forgotten. that the children born in chains deserve remembrance, and that the nation built on their suffering cannot claim innocence. This history is not comfortable, and it is not meant to be. It is raw, brutal, and unsettling because it forces us to look at the foundations of America without illusion, but within that darkness there is also resilience. The EU enslaved endured what was designed to break them. Their descendants live on, carrying memory in their blood, searching for answers in silence, refusing to let the past remain buried. That survival, against a system designed to erase them, is itself a form of victory. The breeding farms were the horror America tried hardest to hide, but the truth is here now, uncovered, undeniable, and once the truth is spoken, silence can no longer protect the lies.